Hello and welcome to Area Talks. This is I'm not sure what to call it. Anyway, the United States currently has, well, basically several bubbles in the economy. And we have traffic issues, job issues, housing. In America, well, it's not like Europe. A lot of the people that came over here, um, the people that I should remember to properly uppercase this, came to the United States, America, where, for the most part, where they came over here were adventurers and, well, treasure seekers. While they are social, they are not for dense living. Even Europe at the time wasn't exactly as dense as it is now. London had 1 million people, if I remember right. Was working on it in about, what was it, 1492. Columbus sails the ocean blue. So you end up with a lot of people over here, they're either looking for a quick buck to escape religious persecution, which happened later. Basically, they weren't allowed to believe in themselves by the United States as a separate church and state. Which means you have a group of people that, well, two groups of people that, well, work best in low human living density. I think it is Davy Crockett who said, "Once you see the..." Yes, I know I'm speaking as I'm typing. It's helping make it better. Of your neighbor's chimney, your chimney. It is time to move again, I think. Don't get that. Don't. Adventures. And yes, my spell check is kind of glitchy. That was a rather amped up. Lots of bad things happened. Lots and lots of bad things happened. I'm gonna leave it at that. You can go where you want. I'm just gonna. But evil things happened. Things we shouldn't have done happened. A lot of things happened. So you have a country founded by people that are not really liking high density. To talk about one of probably Freud's better remarks is the hedgehog paradox, where they move closer together when it's cold, but the risk of injuring the more intimate you are goes up. Great example. So you have a lot of people that, well, they have really long spines. They're like beyond porcupine. So they don't even like knowing the neighbors exist. I mean, that doesn't mean they go into town and they don't socialize, they don't have their ways of meeting up and their social engagements. So you have a group of people that really like, and then on top of that, they are very industrious, to use an older term. They are independent and like being largely self-sufficient. Sufficient. Whatever. Watch me misspell other things up shape here. But whatever. Sufficient. Whatever, it's misspelled. You can hear me say it. It's probably close enough some of you can figure it out. So they like being self-sufficient. They like the farm. They want land. You want to be like the land owning nobles back in Europe. Oh, we don't need Toto around here. But anyway, we're not in Kansas. I'm not in Kansas, and I don't own a dog named Toto. And I'm not resurrecting any corpse dogs. No, thank you. But you end up with a group of very hardworking, honest, a little blunt, kind of like Wagon Train, but not really. And, eventually this continues. The United States is a very low population density, very urban, mostly rural farmer community. There's some big cities, and they're mostly on rivers and ports like New York that's got issues. They built the Brooklyn Bridge, and the people sued that it was too short. They found in World War II it was too short. It's actually part of the problem of New York is they cut off their own dockyards by building bridges to supply the town because the rich landlord wanted to make money. At least that's what I've read. So you end up with a group of people that, in general, are hardworking, but they don't really do in-your-face well. They'll go into town, and they enjoy being in town, and they bring the crops into town, and they like their socials, but for the most part, day in, day out, high-density people in their face, not their thing. And eventually you have booms and busts. The United States had a lot of booms and busts on farms, and you have bankers that thought that money didn't know what a graph was. Not J.P. Morgan. They couldn't. Well, they couldn't do it very well. They just weren't great at it. J.P. Morgan won the Federal Reserve because he was tired of bailing their butts out over and over and over again. Go bring it up with J.P. Morgan. Morgan Stanley and J.P. Morgan Chase are, well, kind of the companies, but a lot of people, no one's perfect at money. And eventually you have World War I, which is big. And then you have the Roaring 20s after kind of several decades of mostly farming. We moved all over the farm. The plow brings rain, so we could go into the Great Plains that actually had sandstorms on the Mississippi River during the American Civil War. There were sandstorms that drowned out towns. And but you have people that don't do density. And eventually you end up with the Great Depression, where I think it peaked at sometimes 55% of the population, 45 definitely. I actually did get to read a chart that is floating around me somewhere in a piece of paper. It's a copy from a book, where unemployment peaked, not whatever. Unemployment peaked around 45%. So you end up with lots of people used to being independent. This is a generation. Within a generation, that culture doesn't completely fade within one generation moving to cities. Used to be independent. So, I'm just going to put self-dependent because that's easier and I can spell it right. And it could be that my spell check doesn't actually know what the other one is. But they're used to be not dependent, reliant. Unit self-reliant, low density. And now they are highly dependent on others. And this is just a huge emotional whiplash. Total 180 to what they're used to. Now, I wasn't alive back then, so I'll get cultural things wrong, but so you have the 180. And also, they had what was it? Was it $1 a day? $1 down and a penny day. I've forgotten the end of the phrase. They had found the power of borrowing money, but not backed by a hard asset like land. Now, radios, borrowing radio near your farm so you can hear, great thing. Having a slight weather report, sometimes even a day ahead, finding out what's going on, like for windstorm, tornadoes, ice storms, so you know what's going on. Better prices to farmers, great, wonderful. Little tech, huge benefit. But you end up with, and then no one had really any money, and the Great Depression is a big economic mess, and it continues into basically 1939, 1941, where people ended up working super overtime and are forced to save like crazy. There is basically no discretional public market. I mean, toys are not made. Toy companies, Lionel made compasses and switches and handsets and stuff, and IBM even made rifle barrels. I mean, toys are not made. Tires, yeah, the United States got cut off from rubber, so tires were rationed. Sugar was rationed because it turns out the United States doesn't grow any sugar except a little bit of Texas and maybe a little bit of Florida. No consumer market, but huge demand. At the same time, in the late Great Depression, companies had figured out planned obsolescence. Basically, they made a product with a very limited lifespan that was not food. Separating food out because food has to plan obsolescence. Like there was a company that made stopwatches, or not stopwatches, but watches, and well, they discovered if they made them dirt cheap, even during the Great Depression, people would spend nothing on them, and they would break in about a month. They'd throw them away, and they made a fortune on watches. So you have World War II in the 1920s and 30s. It would be unimaginable to sell products that didn't last a long time. Basically, it was supposed to be forever. Even Lionel ran on that in the 1950s, and it's pretty proven. I own some of those things. They still run, and some of them were made in like 1948. That was 76 years ago, and they still run. Very well made. Maybe not as fancy as we'd like today, but definitely well built. And then you have, after the war, you still have this whole concept. You have movies, westerns, the Hays Code, which highly restricted media to mostly westerns and Shakespeare, a lot of Shakespeare, and classic plays that had already existed. Those were what were allowed. I see. Restricted. Yeah, so you didn't have a lot of media, which also means reinforcement of everyone is a noble, because nobles have money, and nobles that's really handy in a story. Noble or a rancher, they have the money to make the story work. Nobles. It's like soap operas today. What are they? Doctors, nurses. It's kind of rare that Homer Simpson's more of the exception to the rule than the norm. Cheers is more of the exception to the norm. Golden Girls is more exception because most of them were either high-paid private eyes, ranchers that have, as you have Green Acres, it's a lawyer. I mean, for the city, you have nobles. Higher parts of society, and land is important in the westerns and the films. So you still have this continuously, because if I remember right, the bartender on Wagon Train, which is a 60s TV show, actually was born in a log cabin. There were still people working in the world that were in log cabins into the 60s and 70s. It used to be very common for people to be born at home, and hospitals had a really bad reputation. There we go. I'm just typing this as I go. So, reinforcement of, everyone's nobles, you have all that. And you have the 1950s. And you have huge, just insane levels of savings in the middle class. Just insane. It's a rare fluke of history. Because the women at that time, they had worked in other industries. They're loaded with cash. They can afford to stay home and look after children because they've already worked they've worked very hard, extra shifts. Eventually, as my grandfather put it, another dollar won't buy my grandfather put it, another dollar will not buy another hour of sleep. So you end up with these guys just have huge savings. And that means that you begin to have suburbia, which I've spelled wrong. That forms. It's like it's kind of like the you have your mini your mini ranch, and there are called ranchettes. Those are usually about 15, 20 acres. There's old subdivisions from even the 1920s, 1930s that are like 5, 10 acres. They keep getting cut up. So you have to have the house, but you don't want the land. But not the land. The land you don't need, because you're not a farmer or a rancher. So the typical housing lot of town lot's fine. You got your house, you got a front yard, the kids can run around the yard, and you got your office job, and The rest of the world's been blown to hell and back again, and the United States hasn't been, apart from like one bomb in Oregon and a little bit on the Aleutian Islands and some overseas territories that went through hell. So you end up with insane money. So the US can afford to do all kinds of basically, how do I put it? Things that don't pay off. It doesn't matter. Everyone has, you don't care if you're earning, $100,000 a year and you're going through bike tires once a week and they cost 2 cents. You're just going to buy new bike tires all year. You don't care. I know that's hyperbole, but it's pretty accurate. So you end up with all kinds of products. You end up with suburbia, and you have cars everywhere, and the car companies had to save the buses that they got in the way of, and you have infrastructure, and the towns change, and suddenly everyone wants to have their money. And they want to look rich, and they never want to be as poor as they lived or grew up as during the Great Depression. Except here's the thing. Credit cards and debt. They had discovered credit cards and debt. So what happens is they have a whole lot of money. And a pile of cash is really easy to borrow against. Finance was considered the boring years of finance even to the 1960s a bit. And eventually you end up with the 13-year banking cycles and credit cards, debt. They discovered... Really? You don't know? Okay, discovered. But they're never going to go back there. They're going to make the world better. And it kind of goes against something the Founding Fathers had realized. You can't fix everything. What you can do is to make things as fair and share opportunity as much as possible. You can't fix everything. What you can do is make it so that people have the ability to seek things. You can't promise it. George Washington obviously cannot promise for 300 years the United States is going to be successful. He's kind of dead. It's a promise he can't keep and a promise he never made. What he did say was the United States should stay out of international business. Now, World War I and World War II, we're going to make a mess out of our world in the United States eventually. So it wasn't denying him. And eventually, well, we discovered that we had all this money. The problem is we also owed 120... owed about 125% of GDP. Yeah, we gave all the bullets and the tanks for on credit. And then the U.S. government. So the U.S. federal government through, or actually it's really with, and leaving the Federal Reserve System in charge, did financial repression. Basically, they slowly devalued the dollar because it's like it has to do with the way finances work, and it doesn't have a really good real-world example. But basically, they cut the pie thinner, and they got away with it because people were making more pies. If you take a standard pie, let's see, can I pull up the artwork thing here? I don't want highlighting. I don't want background color. Show draw functions. Okay, where's that thing here? Basically, you have a pie. And you have, oh, let me go over here again. Make another pie. There. Sorry, I had to sneeze. And initially, the pie would have looked like this, and they owed more than that. Well, in finance, you can shrink as time goes on. Basically, what you do is you cut the pie thinner. So instead of 4 pieces, it's 8. But you've only promised 4 pieces of pie. So you get to keep half the pie now. Even though the original contract left out the percentage of the pie you owned, just the number of pieces you owed. So you had 1, 2, 3, 4, you still gave 4, but you're actually only giving half a pie. So basically what happened is, this is what happens when you devalue currencies. They don't buy as much. It reduces the purchasing power. The amount you can buy with a single US dollar. It's very hard to calculate. The markets have changed. How goods are made has changed. It's a huge interconnected web. You can do quick and dirty math and come up with some really bizarre numbers. But here's the thing about financial repression. It also pays off the old debt. It's actually, it pays it off slowly. So the United States, by the 1970s and 60s, began to hit stagflation. Partially because we actually hadn't dealt with the issues of the Great Depression 30 or 40 years earlier. We came up with the Great Society. Now, I am all for affordable health care. Before anyone's going to jump down my throat, health care, social services, totally fine for it. Totally all for it. Let me get rid of those little caps that I don't want. But I will put this, I'm all for affordable, yeah. Maybe I will just all caps it. Or bold it. That's italic. Social civil services, all for that. Problem is, someone discovered that you could borrow more money, and you could keep borrowing more money, and no one could tell you to not borrow any money, and you have a group of people that, well, they're not going back there, they're not going to the Great Depression, they will borrow their way out if they have to. They will max off the credit cards, and they don't care to pay them off. Why? It doesn't happen in their lifetime, so they don't care. It's invisible to them, it's put into the future. They got their house, they got their car, they have their mini ranch thing, model ranch that they watched in the Westerns as a kid. They've had the children. It looks like it's all good. The problem is it's a giant Ponzi scheme. As someone's put it. Even though it's not really a Ponzi scheme, it's more of a Bernie Madoff. Ponzi was actually good for about 80 to 85% of what he owed. He wasn't actually selling junk, and he wasn't actually scamming people. His name's still on it. He was still a crook. But compared to some schemes that have come out later, he was flat out solvent. WorldCom, where everyone ended up 2 pennies on the $100 shares, come to mind, 2% return. 80%, 80, 98% loss, 99% loss. And that was in 2001. The problem is we started borrowing for everything. So we discovered, oh, you could just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. Well, the problem is borrowing feeds back into this, except now you're borrowing more pies. So now you're using your pie, and well, and someone else's pie, because you paid off your houses, and you got paid off. That's good. You got all your stuff paid off, except the street out front isn't paid off. You're not paying enough. You're actually borrowing fixed street up front, so you borrow from another person. Come on, there we go. So you have to go borrow another pie. And you're hoping that as time goes on, these pies will be bigger and you'll easily pay it back. Well, the problem is, it's great to borrow if it's going to pay itself off. Well, I don't want this bolt, but buy or procure it. You should be, beating it. You should be coming out ahead. You borrow money to buy farmland like their ancestors did. You're making 20% profit on a 10% loan. You can make 30% on a 20% loan. You're going to be fine. It's going to suck, but you're going to be able to pay it off. It's not going to be a problem. The problem was that didn't happen because the interest, as Albert Einstein put it, compound interest is the most, I've heard him say this. I mostly hear this in Civ 5 when I play it. It's the most powerful. Worst in the universe. If you want to really see how powerful it is, I'm not going to make a spreadsheet. What I am going to see is I'm going to draw a line. It's going to, let's see, can I just, yeah, I can draw a line. No, I want the draw tool. Because this is, come here, computer, thank you. This is how we think interest works. That's not how interest works. It works like this. It looks small, and then it just, I know this isn't perfect straight, but it's good enough. You can kind of see what's going on. It explodes. Because it's like the trouble with tribbles in Star Trek. You start with 2, 1 times 2 is 4. Okay. And then you have 4 times 2 equals 8. This is just doubling every time. It's not exactly how interest works, but it's to make an extreme example. And then you have 8 times 16, or 8 times 2 equals 16. It does that. That's basically, it compounds itself, because while interest is compounded in a decimal point form using as a percentage, I'm just multiplying it by 200%, if you want to know. That's just quick and dirty math. Watch it explode. The problem is, you can see, this is how bad the debt got at 200%, and just, yeah. It's an extreme example. It's just there for example. But the problem is the pie, when your pie, you borrowed a pie, and you've borrowed a pie, and you borrowed a pie, you can begin to see the problem. These pies actually aren't as big as you think they are. Because what's happening is every one of those pies, it's called you used to have money. Because you have the original pie, but you owe on that one, so you made another pie. And another pie. Didn't really grow much, because you end up owing more and more pieces of the pie. You know, you started off owing, since you don't pay it off, actually, you know, you haven't paid the street, never gets paid off, because the maintenance wasn't part of the budget. You just charged up a credit card that wasn't even yours, and now you have a road. It's cool, we got a road. 20 years later, when the pipe leaks and it floods your street, who's stuck with the bill? And you didn't pay an installment plan to pay off that debt in the meantime, did you? Now you have to pay the whole thing off. And that means that, well, over time, the infrastructure was bought with basically no money to maintain it, or a vast majority. And that begins to be a problem. You know, now we have, before, it has no money basically budget before it was put in. It's budgeted afterward, and that doesn't really work. At the same time, you're doing this with the pies all the way up here. You keep cutting that pie smaller, which means that, well, your money doesn't go as far, but you still have to replace just as much infrastructure, if not more infrastructure. So you end up in this, the money buys less, so you borrow more to make up for the money buying less. At the same time, you had a fluke of history. An absolute fluke. The American 1950s are a fluke. They are not the norm, even by U.S. standards. For most of history, married couples both worked. It was common on the Great Plains. She worked to pay day-to-day bills, and he worked to pay the mortgage. She'd bring the food in, he paid off the land. It was common, at least that's one arrangement I heard on Texas Ranch House. For example, it's an example of something I've heard. But we still want all our houses. We taught, home ownership is the way to the future. But the thing is, you didn't pay for any of the infrastructure to support the house. And you borrowed money to buy the house. And the companies had discovered that there was no money in selling 100-year-old buildings, In the 1400s, if you bought a cooking pot, it was expected to last, according to, was it Secret of the Castle? That whole series. Or is it the Green Valley? No, it was the Industrial Zone. 200 to 300 years. By the 1900s, it was 20 to 30. Because if you're doing mass production, you have to keep selling stuff, or you're going to have to lay people off. And the problem is you can't grow food in the city. Doesn't work very well. You can grow some. There were victory gardens, but it's not like a farm. And you've discovered debt, which means that, well, if you want to do those great social programs, well, that's how we got out of the Great Depression. We borrowed our way out of it. The problem is we never made any money. We printed money, and Europe paid us a lot of return fees for the money we loaned them, which meant that we were living an awful lot on other people's debt repayment to us. We were a creditor nation because we had the credit and they had the debt. Germany and England have finished paying off most of their, if not all, their World War II debt to us, and the U.S. economy did not respond well when you look at our GDP numbers to debt ratios that are a mess. I'm going to leave it as a mess because I'm not going to deal with all those numbers. Since I can't verify them myself and they're official numbers, I just know they're a mess. They get redefined and people come up with new formulas, and it makes trying to do historical comparisons basically impossible for me with the information I've been able to find. So, not even going to go there. So you end up with was against being poor. Why? First, because we don't want to go back there, and we don't like poor people. You're all supposed to be nobles. We're the Americans. We're supposed to be all middle class. The problem is middle class used to be doctors and nurses were definitely middle class, and shopkeepers. We don't have a lot of shopkeepers anymore. We have a lot of Walmarts, but we don't have a lot of shopkeepers anymore. And it was the small block toy salesman guy, and it was the tackle maker, and the blacksmith, and the blacksmith might be your dentist, or your cancer surgeon, and your barber, depending on what area you lived in, and where you lived. But you eventually ended up with more and more debt. Yeah, debt was used to fuel everything. This also caused a problem with Jevons paradox. Because while there had been big finance before him, it really took off later. Jevons paradox is that the more efficient it is to use a finite resource, the more of that resource you will use. Which comes about with him and the coal question, which I've read part of. So you end up with, you're using a finite resource. Except what happens when you can ignore that it's finite? Oh look, you borrow money. You could ignore that your wallet's small. And you can continue to ignore your wallet's small, and that things aren't paid out of pocket anymore, and everything's paid with debt. And debt is so easy to borrow, and it makes things so easy. Which eventually means you get a debt trap. Which is what's kind of happening. You either have to print it away, 1970s, that was debt paying off by the United States. It's stagflation. It sucked. We've had it again. Shrinkflation. All come from that. Your money doesn't buy as much. So you buy more, and well, the debt made it so you could buy it. You could buy all those home computers. You could build those fabs. The other thing is, like in computer tech right now, they've hit a cost ceiling. It's just exponential. Because guess what? You live on a finite planet, but you're using the cost of getting more materials eventually hits a ceiling. So you have a country, the United States right now, a lot of our problems are, well, pride. We have a lot of pride. We are very, very entitled. I have seen the word entitled or you deserve way too much. Way too much. A better word is you have earned it. Entitled is the wrong word. So is deserved. You have earned it is a better word. Because people work hard. They deserve the fruit of their wages, fruit of their work. Mellon, right, the former, oddly enough, head of the Federal Reserve, pointed out, man on the bottom shouldn't pay high taxes because most of his money that he earns goes into paying for his room and board, his food, his house, his transportation. It goes into living. He doesn't have a lot of discretionary money, except borrowing makes you pretend you have a lot of more money. Because you get to do this with your money. You get to just keep borrowing it. So now you have the current problem in the United States. Entitlement. English as a language is, well, in decline. And I mean decline as in simplification and awfulization. I don't know how to properly spell that words, but English is decline as in it's simplified. The word love. C.S. Lewis was annoyed with how much he wrote the four loves. You have words losing meanings. It's dumbed down, which is not good for anyone. Languages evolve. Words change meaning. That's good. But you shouldn't be cutting out most of your vocabulary that you use to order a hamburger. That becomes a problem, or when you're trying to express your emotions, which causes a feedback loop. So you have an entitled, we can't be poor culture, and at the same time, most of the businesses ran on debt. And, well, and the government runs on debt. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it. The problem is there's a difference between borrowing the money to put in a toll bridge or getting a payday loan to fix the stitches in your hand, or forcing everyone to go out and take out another home mortgage so that everyone else can have health care but you. And you still have to pay for your own, which causes problems. There's all kinds of issues. I don't know how to best put them. They're a mess. The problem is being addicted to debt, which is what happened. That makes game we want easier, needier, and more expedient. More instant gratification. So you have more expedient, more instant gratification. It's easier, and now you have this high turnover, mega monopoly, debt's cheap. I mean, I'm not going to solve these things. Unfortunately, I don't. Solutions. I just don't. What I do know is you can change your vocabulary. We will all You can disagree with me on some of those, that's fine. We will all need food, you know, that. And the mind, we will always need all these things. You know, we always need food, our wounds treated, shelter, which includes clothing, because it's kind of like a portable shelter you're wearing. You can change your vocabulary, and you can try. Well, I can say, well, you won't always have the opportunity, so I won't type it down. But you can. What you can do is ask. Ask what's important to you. You can do that. I don't know. I can't make the decision for you. As for the the overexuberance, I don't know how else to put it, built up debt. Well, it is going to take hard work to go forward. And manage, and well, hopefully, I can't, it's like, for all I know, by the time some of you will see this video, I don't know, maybe 300 years from now, I don't know. It's going to take a lot of work to go forward and manage. Anyway, that's kind of how the United States, we, well, want the past to avoid the pain of the past and a good future. The problem comes when it comes at the price of the future. Borrowing from the future for a better today only goes so far. Where is borrowing? Look at it as borrowing, I think. I'm a shape reader. Okay. But we can get through most of these problems. Some of them I don't know how. Some of them I know there's solutions, like more pedestrian-friendly cities. Using AI responsibly and not to just fire everyone. Using it to like fix the Beatles' voice, that will help. That's kind of what the issues are. We're so used to, well, there's just going to be a new class of workers. The problem is what happens when all the workers' paychecks were used up years ago and their bank accounts are empty. Oh, they're not going to buy anything. And now they're borrowing on debt. You know, it's really sad when people have to borrow money to eat food. And then everyone's like, we're just going to shrink the pie. We're just going to cut it thinner. Well, that's great. Eventually you reach to the point that there's not enough pie to survive on. I'm not sure where this is going. I just know is part, a small part. A small part And to be honest, all those people back then thought it was going to work out great. You know, look good for them, so they thought it would be good for others. That's very normal. That's what normalcy bias? But, you know, it's kind of what we got here. We decided that we are just going to borrow away out of our troubles. It's the same as drinking. It doesn't really work. You still have to deal with the issue in the end, don't you? When you sober up, it's still there. How are you going to deal with industrialization? Well, the big companies that had to have the profits go up. Everything has to grow infinitely, except the farm's only got so many acres. The planet's only so big. I'll go into more of that later. Anyway, I see you next time. You like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help. And yes, I know I'm doing this whole boring style. I live in the AI era. So hopefully you can tell it's actually a person and not an AI. So it's got to be a little jank now. Good thinking, but if I put too much polish on it, I'm not going to stick out anymore. So, I'll see you guys next time.